Someone get this man a visitor badge before he starts asking for coffee money. The laughter hit the glass walls of the 42nd floor boardroom and bounced back louder, sharper, uglier, filling every inch of polished space with something colder than humor. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now back to Malcolm Hayes. He didn't flinch. Not when Richard Calloway leaned back in his leather chair with that smug half-smile. Not when a few executives exchanged glances and smirked like they'd already decided what kind of man stood in front of them. Malcolm just stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady, taking in the room the way a man studies something he already owns but hasn't claimed yet. The skyline of Chicago stretched behind them through floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Michigan catching the morning light, but inside this room, the air felt heavier, tighter, like something was about to crack. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, slow and deliberate, making sure every eye was still on him. We don't usually let walk-ins interrupt executive sessions, he added, voice smooth but laced with something sharper underneath. A few quiet chuckles followed, softer this time, more controlled, like they were testing how far they could go. Malcolm's outfit didn't help his case in their eyes. A black sweater, clean but simple. Dark jeans. Shoes polished, but not flashy. No watch catching the light. No logo screaming money. Just a man who didn't match the image they had already decided belonged at that table. Emily Foster, seated to Richard's right, leaned forward slightly, her eyes scanning Malcolm like she was searching for a detail that would justify the dismissal already forming in her mind. Do you even have an appointment? She asked, her tone polite enough on the surface, but thin, stretched tight over disbelief. Malcolm let the question hang for a second, not out of hesitation, but intention. He glanced around the room, taking in each face, each expression, each quiet judgment. Disguised as professionalism. Then he spoke, his voice calm, measured, cutting clean through the noise without ever rising. I'm exactly where I need to be. That didn't land the way they expected. It didn't provoke anger. It didn't spark respect. It triggered something else, more laughter, a little louder now, a little less restrained. Richard shook his head, amused, like he'd just been handed a story he couldn't wait to repeat later. Confident, he said. I'll give you that. He gestured vaguely toward the door without even looking at it. But confidence doesn't buy companies. Another ripple of laughter. Malcolm's gaze didn't move. Not to the door. Not to the people laughing. Just back to Richard, steady and unbothered. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that doesn't explain itself. And for a brief second, so quick most people missed it, Richard's smile faltered. Not gone. Just thinner. Because something about the way Malcolm stood there didn't match the narrative they were trying to force onto him. It didn't look like someone out of place. It looked like someone waiting for the right moment to let everyone else realize they were. Malcolm did not take the empty chair near the wall, the one subtly pushed out as if it were the only place he deserved. Instead, he walked past it with unhurried steps and stopped just short of the long polished table, close enough to be seen clearly but far enough to remain outside their structure, and that alone shifted something in the room, small but noticeable, like a note slightly off-key in a controlled symphony. Richard watched him with a narrowing gaze, fingers tapping once against the table as if recalibrating his read on the situation, while Emily leaned back in her chair, arms crossing now, her earlier amusement cooling into scrutiny. Because Malcolm was not reacting the way people usually did when they were out of place, he was not apologizing, not explaining, not even trying to prove anything, he simply existed there with a quiet certainty that did not ask for validation. Let us make this simple, Derek Sloan said from the far end, his voice measured but edged with authority, the kind that assumed compliance before it was given. This floor is restricted to executive personnel and verified investors. So unless you can demonstrate that you fall into one of those categories, we are going to have to ask you to step out. And he gestured lightly toward the glass door, not aggressively, just firmly enough to signal that the decision had already been made. Malcolm turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Derek's eyes, and there was no irritation in his expression, no defensiveness. Only a calm that felt almost out of place in a room designed for power plays and quick judgments, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same steady weight as before. "You are assuming I need to prove something to you." And the sentence did not rise at the end, did not ask permission, it simply settled into the air like a fact waiting to be understood. A few of the executives exchanged glances again, this time less amused, more uncertain, because confidence without context can feel unsettling. And Malcolm was offering no context at all. Emily let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it lacked the ease from before. "That is exactly how this works," she said, leaning forward again, sharper now. "You prove your value before you take up space at this table." And Malcolm's eyes moved to her, not challenging, not dismissive, just present, as if he were listening to something he had heard many times before. For a moment, the room held that tension, thin but growing, and then Richard spoke again, his tone smoother now, controlled, but with an undercurrent that had not been there before. "Look, whatever meeting you think you are here for, this is not it," he said, folding his hands together, posture straightening as he reasserted his role at the head of the table. "We are in the middle of final stage negotiations with a serious acquisition partner, so unless you are representing them, you are wasting everyone's time." And that word, serious, lingered longer than the rest. Pointed without being direct, Malcolm nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the statement rather than reacting to it, and his gaze drifted briefly to the large screen mounted on the wall, still displaying financial projections and a pending transaction timeline, numbers and charts that told a story the room believed it understood, and then back to Richard, and when he spoke again, it was quieter than before but somehow carried further. "Then it would be a mistake to interrupt that process," he said, and something in the phrasing made Derek's brow tighten slightly, because it did not sound like a man being dismissed, it sounded like a man commenting on an outcome already in motion. Near the back of the room, almost unnoticed until now, Nina Brooks sat with her tablet open, her fingers paused mid-note as she watched the exchange unfold, and there was something about Malcolm's tone, the precision of his words, the absence of urgency, that did not align with the version of him the others had already decided on, and without fully realizing why, she glanced down at her screen, where a flagged internal notification had just appeared, marked confidential and time sensitive, and her eyes flicked between the name on that alert and the man standing across the room, a connection beginning to form that had not yet reached the rest of them, not yet, but close enough to change everything once it did. The room did not move, but the energy inside it shifted, tightening around Malcolm like an invisible test. None of them realized they were failing, and Richard leaned forward again, this time no longer amused, his voice carrying a sharper edge as if patience had expired. "Let me be very clear," he said, each word measured but firm. "This is a closed executive session, and we are not in the habit of entertaining unverified individuals during critical negotiations." And he tapped the table once. Subtle but intentional, signaling authority to everyone watching, as if the room itself needed to remember who controlled it. Derek followed immediately, stepping into the moment with practiced precision. "Security is available if needed," he added, not loud, but loud enough, the kind of sentence designed to escalate without appearing aggressive, and a few heads nodded slightly, not because they believed Malcolm was a threat, but because the system in that room always moved in one direction when someone did not fit the expected image. Malcolm's expression did not change, not when the word security landed, not when the glances around the table grew more pointed, he simply shifted his weight slightly, grounded, composed, as if time itself was moving differently for him than for everyone else. Emily exhaled and reached for a file, flipping it open with a soft but deliberate motion. "You said you are here for the acquisition discussion," she said, her tone now clinical, distancing itself from the earlier laughter. "Then tell us which firm you represent." And she looked up at him with a gaze that expected hesitation, expected uncertainty, expected exposure. But Malcolm did not rush to answer. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make the question feel smaller than she intended. "The one finalizing your outcome," he said, and the sentence landed differently than anything before it, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, like a key sliding into a lock no one else knew existed. Derek frowned immediately, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "That is not how this works," he said quickly, almost too quickly, as if correcting the narrative before it could take shape. "All parties have been disclosed and vetted." And Richard gave a small nod, reinforcing the statement, but there was a fraction of a second where his eyes flicked toward the screen again, just to check, just to confirm something he had not needed to confirm before. Malcolm followed that glance without moving his head, aware of the numbers, the projections, the timeline counting down to a close everyone in the room believed they controlled, and he asked quietly, "Then why is your closing time still marked as pending?" And that question did not challenge them directly, it exposed something small but enough to create a crack. Emily's hand paused on the page she was holding, Derek's jaw tightened, and Richard leaned back again, slower this time. Recalculating, because Malcolm was not guessing, he was referencing, and that meant access, or knowledge, or both. Near the back, Nina's eyes moved rapidly across her tablet now, the confidential alert. Expanding into a detailed document, acquisition layers, shell entities, holding structures, and at the center of it all one name appeared again and again, Hayes Global Ventures, and her breath caught slightly as she scrolled, because the percentages were not small, not speculative, they were controlling, decisive, and her gaze lifted from the screen back to Malcolm, the alignment snapping into place with quiet clarity. "This is not possible," Derek said under his breath, but it was loud enough to be heard because uncertainty had begun to leak into the room, and uncertainty did not belong there. Malcolm looked at him then, not with confrontation, but with something steadier, almost patient. "It already happened," he replied, and the difference between those two sentences, not possible and already happened, hung in the air like a dividing line the room had not crossed yet but was standing dangerously close to. Richard's smile returned, but it was thinner now, controlled. "If you are trying to make a point, you have made it," he said, though his tone suggested he was no longer entirely sure what that point was. "But this conversation is over." And he gestured again toward the door, firmer this time, as if ending the scene would restore order. Malcolm did not move, not toward the door, not toward the table, he simply remained where he was, and in that stillness there was something undeniable, something that did not align with dismissal, and for the first time, the room was not laughing, not reacting, just watching, waiting, because somewhere between the questions and the answers, control had started to shift, and no one had said it out loud yet, but they were beginning to feel it. The silence stretched just long enough to make every executive in the room aware that something had shifted, even if they could not yet explain what it was, and then, from the far end of the table, a voice broke through, not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakably steady. "Wait," Nina Brooks said, her words cutting across the tension with a clarity that did not belong to someone in her position, and every head turned toward her, some irritated, some surprised, because junior analysts did not interrupt executive sessions, not here, not like this. Derek's reaction was immediate, sharp, controlled. "This is not your place to speak," he said, his tone low but firm, a warning more than a correction, but Nina did not look at him. Her eyes were locked on Malcolm, then back to her tablet, then back to Malcolm again, as if confirming something that had already settled in her mind. "I think it is," she replied, quieter now but no less certain, and that hesitation in her voice was not doubt, it was the weight of stepping outside a system that had rules she was choosing to break in real time. Richard's expression tightened, irritation flickering beneath the surface. "If you have something relevant, make it quick," he said, not granting permission so much as containing disruption. But Nina did not rush, she turned her tablet slightly so the screen faced her colleagues, though most of them had not yet leaned in to see it. "The acquisition partner," she said, choosing her words carefully, "has not been disclosed because it is structured through layered holdings." And that alone drew attention, because that level of detail was not something casually accessed, not something guessed, it was internal, precise. Emily leaned forward instinctively now, her earlier confidence narrowing into focus. "We already know that," she said, but her voice lacked the certainty it had carried before, and Nina shook her head slightly. No, not like this, she continued, her finger scrolling once across the screen. The controlling interest is not external in the way we assumed, it is already consolidated. And that word consolidated landed heavily, because it implied completion, not negotiation. Derek stood slightly from his seat, his composure thinning. You are misreading preliminary data, he said quickly, but Nina's eyes did not leave the screen. This is not preliminary, she replied, and then, for the first time, she said the name out loud. Hayes Global Ventures. And the room reacted in a way it had not before, not with laughter, not with dismissal, but with a pause that felt like recognition trying to surface. Richard's gaze sharpened instantly, shifting between Nina and Malcolm, calculating, searching for alignment, for contradiction, for anything that would restore the narrative he had been controlling just moments ago. That firm is part of the bidder pool, he said, but even as he said it, the words sounded less like a statement and more like a question. Nina nodded once, slowly. It was, she corrected. But it is not bidding anymore. And she finally looked up, directly at Malcolm, the weight of the realization settling fully into place. It already closed. And the room did not react immediately, because the meaning of that sentence had to travel, had to connect pieces that had been deliberately kept separate, and in that brief gap, Malcolm remained exactly as he had been from the beginning, still, composed, unshaken, as if none of this was new information to him, because it was not. Emily's hand tightened slightly around her pen. That is not possible without board confirmation, she said, but her voice had dropped, the volume of certainty replaced by the pressure of doubt, and Malcolm's gaze moved to her, calm, direct. Then you should check who confirmed it, he said, and the simplicity of that response did more than challenge her. It redirected the entire room's attention inward, toward systems they trusted without question. Derek reached for his laptop now, faster than before, typing with urgency that had not existed minutes ago, while Richard leaned forward again, his earlier confidence replaced by something sharper, more controlled. If this is some kind of misunderstanding, he began, but Nina interrupted, not loudly, but definitively. It is not, she said, and for the first time, no one told her to stop, because what she was saying had already begun to feel real. Malcolm took a single step closer to the table, not aggressive, not dominant, just enough to close the distance between observer and participant, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority it had from the moment he entered, but now it landed differently, heavier, anchored by the truth the room was finally starting to see. You were not being evaluated for a partnership, he said, his eyes moving across each face in turn. You were being evaluated for leadership under new ownership. And the words did not echo, they settled, final, and in that moment, the laughter from earlier felt distant, almost unreal, because the room they had been laughing in no longer existed in the same way. Something had changed, and this time, everyone felt it. The room did not explode into chaos the way people expect when power shifts. It tightened instead, like a system trying to hold itself together after realizing it had already lost control, and Richard Calloway sat very still, his fingers no longer tapping, his posture no longer relaxed, because for the first time since Malcolm walked in, he was not performing authority, he was measuring risk. That is a very serious claim, Richard said slowly, each word carefully placed, not dismissing, not accepting, buying time, and I do not act on claims without verification. And that sounded reasonable, controlled, almost responsible, but the edge underneath it had changed. It was no longer confidence, it was defense. Malcolm did not respond immediately, he let the statement sit, then his eyes moved briefly toward Derek, who was still typing, faster now, pulling up internal systems that were supposed to confirm control, hierarchy, certainty, but the longer he searched, the quieter his keyboard became, until finally he stopped altogether, not because he had finished, but because he had found something he did not expect. Emily leaned toward him, her voice lowered, urgent. What is it? She asked, but Derek did not answer right away, his eyes fixed on the screen, his expression tightening in a way that no one in that room had seen before, and when he finally spoke, it was not with authority, it was with hesitation. There is a transfer log, he said, and even that sentence felt incomplete, like he was still trying to understand what he was reading. Nina did not look surprised, not anymore. She had already crossed that moment, but the rest of the room was catching up, slowly, unevenly, and Richard turned his attention sharply. "Read it," he said, no longer asking, and Derek swallowed once before continuing. "Majority shares, consolidated under Hayes Global Ventures. Effective this morning." And the words did not echo, they landed, heavy, undeniable, real. Emily leaned back slightly, as if distance could create clarity. "That would require board approval," she said, but this time it sounded less like a challenge and more like a question she already feared the answer to, and Malcolm's voice entered again, calm as ever. "It did," he said, and something in the simplicity of that response carried more weight than any document could. For a brief moment, no one spoke, because the structure they trusted had just confirmed something they had already tried to reject, and in that silence, Malcolm's mind drifted, not away from the room, but backward, to a memory that sat quietly beneath everything happening now, a different building, a different floor, years earlier, when he was 25 years old and walked into an investment office in a suit he could barely afford, portfolio in hand. Confidence built on numbers he had studied for months, and the receptionist had looked at him the same way Emily had, the same way Richard had, measuring not his work, but his presence, and a man had stepped out from behind a glass door, glanced at Malcolm once, and said, "We are not taking walk-ins today." Without ever asking who he was, Malcolm remembered standing there, not angry, not loud, just aware that the decision had already been made before he spoke, before he explained, before he existed in their system, and he remembered leaving that building with his plan still intact, unchanged, but with something else added to it, something sharper, a quiet understanding that access was never given, it was taken, structured, built in ways that did not require permission. Back in the present, the boardroom felt smaller, the glass walls no longer transparent but reflective, showing each person a version of themselves they were not used to seeing. And Malcolm looked at Richard again, not with satisfaction, not with revenge, but with clarity. "You did not verify me when I walked in," he said, his tone even, controlled. "You judged me." And the sentence did not accuse, it revealed, it placed the responsibility exactly where it belonged. Richard opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, to correct, to reframe, but nothing came out immediately, because the position he had been standing on was no longer there, and for the first time, the man who had controlled the room was now inside it, not above it, subject to the same reality as everyone else, and Malcolm did not raise his voice, did not step closer, did not change his posture, because he did not need to. The shift had already happened, and everyone in that room could feel it. The air in the boardroom no longer felt controlled, it felt observed, as if every word now carried consequence instead of assumption, and Malcolm let the silence stretch just long enough for that realization to settle fully before he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, not in a dramatic gesture, not to prove anything, but with the quiet familiarity of someone continuing a process already in motion. Richard's eyes followed the movement immediately, sharp, alert, searching for an angle. "If this is some kind of stunt," he began, but Malcolm did not look at him. He simply raised the phone to his ear and spoke with calm precision. "Angela, we are ready for final confirmation." And his voice did not carry urgency, it carried expectation. On the other end, Angela Reed responded without hesitation, her tone crisp, professional. "Understood, Malcolm. Board access is live and compliance has been notified. Do you want me to initiate executive review?" And the moment her voice came through the room shifted again, because this was not improvisation, this was structure, this was alignment, this was something that existed far beyond the walls they were sitting in. Malcolm nodded slightly, though she could not see him. "Yes, initiate full executive review and freeze current leadership permissions," he said, and that sentence did not land as a threat, it landed as procedure. Emily straightened in her chair, her earlier composure cracking just enough to reveal concern. "You cannot just freeze executive permissions," she said, but even as she spoke her hand moved toward her laptop, instinctively checking access she had never questioned before, and when she tried to open a secure file, the system paused longer than usual, just a fraction of a second, but enough to change the way she breathed. Derek moved faster, typing again, this time not searching, but verifying, confirming what he did not want to confirm, and his screen responded with a message he had never seen before, authorization pending under new controlling entity, and he stopped again, this time completely. Richard remained still. But his stillness was different now, not controlled, not composed, but calculated, as if he were trying to find a version of this situation where he still held ground. This requires board approval, he said again, but the repetition carried less authority than before, more insistence than certainty. Malcolm finally looked at him, fully now, direct and steady. It already has it, he said, and then, without raising his voice, he added, you just were not in the room when it happened. And that sentence did more than respond, it reframed everything, because it placed Richard outside of the very system he believed he controlled. The large screen at the front of the room flickered slightly, not a failure, but a transition, and then the Callaway Systems logo was replaced by another, Hayes Global Ventures, clean, minimal, undeniable, and beneath it a live connection opened, revealing a panel of faces, legal counsel, board members, compliance officers. People whose authority did not need introduction, and Angela appeared among them, composed, focused. This session is now under executive review, she announced, her voice filling the room with a clarity that left no space for interpretation. Effective as of 9:32 a.m. Central Time, controlling ownership of Callaway Systems has been transferred to Hayes Global Ventures, with Malcolm Hayes as majority stakeholder. And the timestamp mattered because it meant this was not unfolding, it had already been decided. A quiet sound came from somewhere near the table, not a voice, not a word, just the subtle shift of someone realizing they were no longer where they thought they were, and Nina lowered her tablet slowly, her earlier certainty now confirmed, while Emily stared at her screen, refreshing access that no longer responded the same way, and Derek leaned back in his chair for the first time, not out of comfort, but because there was nothing left to reach for. Malcolm remained exactly where he had been, not stepping forward, not claiming the head of the table, because he did not need to move to change position. The room had already moved around him, and when he spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, just final. We are not starting a negotiation, he said, his eyes moving across each face. We are completing a transition. And the difference between those two things settled over the room like a closing door, quiet, irreversible, and understood. No one spoke immediately after the screen settled, because the truth did not arrive with noise, it arrived with confirmation, layered, documented, witnessed, and impossible to reverse, and Malcolm let that silence breathe for a moment longer before he stepped forward, not aggressively, not to dominate, but to take the position that had already become his, stopping at the head of the table where Richard still sat, frozen between reaction and denial. You asked who I represent, Malcolm said, his voice calm but now carrying a weight that had not been fully visible before. I represent the entity that now controls this company. And the words did not rise, did not demand attention, they simply replaced the version of reality that had existed seconds earlier. Richard looked up at him, and for the first time, there was no trace of amusement left, only calculation struggling against inevitability. This is highly irregular, he said, but the sentence felt smaller than the moment, like a technicality trying to stand against a completed decision. Malcolm held his gaze, steady, unshaken. No, he replied. What is irregular is how you treated someone you believed had no power. And that sentence landed deeper than anything about ownership, because it was not about the transaction, it was about the behavior that preceded it. Emily shifted in her seat, her composure now visibly strained. If there has been a misunderstanding, we can address it professionally, she said, her tone changing, recalibrating, but Malcolm's eyes moved to her without hostility, just clarity. There was no misunderstanding, he said. You made your position clear the moment I walked in. And she did not respond, because there was nothing left to correct. Derek looked down at his screen again, then back up, as if hoping the system would contradict itself, but it did not, and the realization settled in his posture, shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance. Malcolm turned slightly, addressing the room now, not as an outsider, not as a visitor, but as the one holding authority that had already been validated beyond debate. "You laughed," he said, his voice even, controlled. "Not because you knew anything about me, but because you assumed everything about me." And the words were not loud, but they carried through the room with a precision that made them impossible to ignore. He paused, just long enough for the weight of that truth to settle, then continued. "You did not question my data, you did not review my position. You did not ask the right questions, you judged what you saw and dismissed what you did not understand." And with each phrase, the room seemed to shrink inward, not physically, but psychologically, as if the space they had relied on for control was now reflecting their decisions back at them. Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, but there was no recovery in the movement, only recognition. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked, quieter now, and Malcolm answered without hesitation. "I am saying that the problem was never whether I belonged in this room," he said, his eyes moving across each face again. "The problem is how you behave when you think someone does not." And that sentence did not just conclude the moment, it redefined it. On the screen, Angela and the board remained present, silent witnesses to the exchange, while the executives at the table sat with the weight of what had just unfolded, not a dramatic collapse, not a loud confrontation, but something more controlled, more precise, a shift in power that exposed character rather than destroying it. Malcolm rested his hand lightly on the back of the chair at the head of the table, not sitting yet, not rushing, because he did not need to claim what was already his, and in that stillness, the message became undeniable. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier, and far more permanent, the understanding that in a single morning, without raising his voice, without demanding respect, he had revealed exactly who deserved to stay in that room and who never truly did. The silence did not break with shouting or panic, it broke with systems responding, quiet confirmations appearing where authority used to sit unquestioned, and one by one the screens in front of the executives began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to be noticed, enough to be understood. Emily refreshed her dashboard again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if giving it time would change the result. But the access panel that had always opened without hesitation now displayed a different status, executive privileges under review, and her fingers paused above the keyboard, hovering in a space where certainty used to exist. Derek's screen followed the same pattern, files that once opened instantly now requiring secondary authorization that did not come, and he leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, the realization settling deeper with every second that passed. On the main display, Angela's voice returned, steady, precise. "Executive permissions are now restricted pending internal review," she said, her tone unchanged, professional, detached. "Interim leadership adjustments will be implemented effective immediately." And the phrasing mattered because it did not accuse, it did not explain, it simply enacted. Richard remained seated, his posture straight but no longer anchored, his eyes moving from the screen to Malcolm and back again, trying to locate the moment where control could be reclaimed. But that moment had already passed, quietly, without announcement. "This is a procedural overreach," he said finally. But the words lacked the force they once carried, more reflex than command, and Malcolm did not interrupt him, did not counter immediately. He allowed the statement to exist, then answered with the same calm clarity that had defined every word he had spoken. "No," he said. "This is procedural accountability." And the difference between those two phrases settled like a line drawn across the room. Nina watched from her seat, her tablet now resting in her lap, no longer needed as proof, because the room itself had become the evidence, every reaction, every silence, every attempt to adjust tone or posture reflecting the truth more clearly than any document could. Malcolm's gaze moved across the table again, not searching, not judging, simply observing, and then he spoke, not to confront, but to conclude the phase they were in. "Effective now, all current executive decisions are subject to review," he said, his voice even, measured. "Leadership is not just about results, it is about conduct, and today made that clear." And no one challenged that, not because they agreed, but because they understood that agreement was no longer the point. Emily closed her laptop slowly, not in defiance, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement that whatever she had access to before was no longer hers to control, and Derek did the same, his movements quieter than before, stripped of the urgency that had driven them minutes earlier. Richard remained the last to move, his hand resting on the table, fingers still, his gaze fixed forward, not at Malcolm, not at the screen, but somewhere in between, where realization meets resistance. And for a brief moment it seemed like he might speak again, might attempt one final assertion, but the words did not come, because the structure that would have supported them was gone. Malcolm finally took the seat at the head of the table, not abruptly, not ceremoniously, just a natural extension of what had already been established, and when he did, the room adjusted without instruction, because authority does not always announce itself, sometimes it is simply recognized. Angela's voice concluded the update on the screen. Transition protocols are now active. Further directives will follow. And the display stabilized, no longer shifting, no longer updating, because the decision phase was complete. Malcolm rested his hands lightly on the table, his posture relaxed but intentional, and looked at the people in front of him, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a clarity that carried more weight than either. This is not about removing people, he said, his voice steady. It is about redefining standards. And the room received that not as a warning, not as a promise, but as a reality that had already begun. The room remained still long after the systems had finished updating, as if everyone inside it needed a moment to understand not just what had changed, but what it meant going forward, and Malcolm did not rush that moment, he allowed it to exist, because real shifts in power are not loud, they are absorbed. He leaned back slightly in the chair that now belonged to him, his gaze steady, not searching for reactions, not measuring responses, simply present, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone now, not corrective, not revealing, but defining. What happened in this room today is not unusual, he said, calm and precise. It just usually goes unchallenged. And that sentence settled over the group with a weight that extended beyond the morning, beyond the transaction, into something deeper, something structural. Richard finally moved, not abruptly, but enough to break his stillness, his hands coming together on the table, fingers interlacing as if trying to hold on to a version of control that no longer applied. What happens next? He asked, and the question was no longer framed as authority, it was framed as uncertainty. Malcolm looked at him directly, not with hostility, not with superiority, but with clarity that did not need to assert itself. Next, he said, we rebuild how this company defines leadership. And he paused briefly, not for effect, but to let the words carry their full meaning. Because performance without respect is not leadership, it is liability. And no one interrupted, no one challenged, because the statement did not leave room for interpretation. Emily lowered her gaze slightly, her earlier confidence replaced by reflection, and Derek sat quietly, his posture no longer defensive, just still, absorbing the outcome they had not prepared for. Malcolm's attention shifted briefly to Nina, who met his gaze with a quiet steadiness of her own, and he gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not public, just enough to acknowledge what she had done, recognizing truth before it was safe to do so. The screen at the front of the room dimmed slightly as the live connection ended, leaving only the reflection of the room itself staring back at them, executives, decisions, consequences. All contained within glass walls that no longer felt like protection. Malcolm rested his hands on the table once more, not claiming space, but setting a standard, and his final words in that room were not loud, not dramatic, but they carried further than anything said before. You did not lose your positions today because of me, he said, his voice steady. You risked them because of how you chose to treat someone you believed did not matter. And the truth in that sentence did not accuse, it revealed, it placed accountability exactly where it belonged. He stood then, not abruptly, not